care to publish it to the world. By her orders, 2 gold medals were struck in his honour. On his death in 1883, a long and eulogistic obituary notice of him appeared in the Court Circular, and a brown memorial brooch of gold, with the late gillie's head on one side and the royal monogram on the other, was designed by Her Majesty for presentation to her Highland servants and cottagers, to be worn by them on the anniversary of his death, with a mourning scarf and pins. In the second series of extracts from the Queen's Highland Journal, published in 1884, her "devoted personal attendant and faithful friend" appears upon almost every page, and is in effect the hero of the book. With an absence of reticence remarkable in royal persons, Victoria seemed to demand in this private and delicate matter the sympathy of the whole nation. And yet, such is the world, there were those who actually treated the relations between their sovereign and her servant as a theme for ribald jests. 2. The busy years hastened away. The traces of time's unimaginable touch grew manifest, and old age, approaching, laid a gentle hold upon Victoria. The grey hair whitened, the mature features mellowed, the short firm figure amplified and moved more slowly, supported by a stick. And simultaneously, in the whole tenor of the Queen's existence, an extraordinary transformation came to pass. The nation's attitude towards her, critical and even hostile as it had been for so many years, altogether changed, while there was a corresponding alteration in the temper of Victoria's own mind. Many causes led to this result. Among them were the repeated strokes of personal misfortune which befell the Queen during a cruelly short space of years. In 1878, the Princess Alice, who had married in 1862 the Prince Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt, died in tragic circumstances. In the following year, the Prince Imperial, the only son of the Empress Eugenie, to whom Victoria, since the catastrophe of 1870, had become devotedly attached, was killed in the Zulu War. 2 years later, in 1881, the Queen lost Lord Beaconsfield, and in 1883 John Brown. In 1884, Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, who had been an invalid from birth, died prematurely shortly after his marriage. Victoria's cup of sorrows was indeed overflowing, and the public, as it watched the widowed mother weeping for her children and her friends, displayed a constantly increasing sympathy. An event which occurred in 1882 revealed and accentuated the feelings of the nation. As the Queen at Windsor was walking from the train to her carriage, a youth named Roderick Maclean fired a pistol at her from a distance of a few yards. An Eton boy struck up Maclean's arm with an umbrella before the pistol went off. No damage was done, and the culprit was at once arrested. This was the last of a series of 7 attempts upon the Queen, attempts which, taking place at sporadic intervals over a period of 40 years, resembled one another in a curious manner. All, with a single exception, were perpetrated by adolescents, whose motives were apparently not murderous, since, save in the case of Maclean, none of their pistols was loaded. These unhappy youths, who, after buying their cheap weapons, stuffed them with gunpowder and paper, and then went off with the certainty of immediate detection to click them in the face of royalty, present a strange problem to the psychologist. But though in each case their actions and their purposes seemed to be so similar, their fates were remarkably varied. The first of them, Edward Oxford, who fired at Victoria within a few months of her marriage, was tried for high treason, declared to be insane, and sent to an asylum for life. It appears, however, that this sentence did not commend itself to Albert, for when, 2 years later, John Francis committed the same offence and was tried upon the same charge, the Prince pronounced that there was no insanity in the matter. "The wretched creature," he told his father, "was not out of his mind, but a thorough scamp. "I hope," he added, "his trial will be conducted with the greatest strictness." Apparently it was. At any rate, the jury shared the view of the Prince, the plea of insanity was set aside, and Francis was found guilty of high treason and condemned to death. But, as there was no proof of an intent to kill or even to wound, after a lengthened deliberation between the Home Secretary and the judges, was commuted for one of transportation for life. As the law stood, these assaults, futile as they were, could only be treated as high treason. The discrepancy between the actual deed and the tremendous penalties involved was obviously grotesque, and it was, besides, clear that a jury, knowing that a verdict of guilty implied a sentence of death, would tend to the alternative course and find the prisoner not guilty but insane, a conclusion which, on the face of it, would have appeared to be the more reasonable. In 1842, therefore, an Act was passed making any attempt to hurt the Queen a misdemeanour, punishable by transportation for 7 years, or imprisonment with or without hard labour for a term not exceeding 3 years, the misdemeanant, at the discretion of the Court, to be publicly or privately whipped as often and in such manner and form as the Court shall direct, not exceeding thrice. The 4 subsequent attempts were all dealt with under this new law. William Bean, in 1842, was sentenced to 18 months' imprisonment. William Hamilton, in 1849, was transported for 7 years, and in 1850 the same sentence was passed upon Lieutenant Robert Pate, who struck the Queen on the head with his cane in Piccadilly. Pate alone among these delinquents was of mature years. He had held a commission in the army, dressed himself as a dandy, and was, the Prince declared, manifestly deranged. In 1872, Arthur O'Connor, a youth of 17, fired an unloaded pistol at the Queen outside Buckingham Palace. He was immediately seized by John Brown and sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment and 20 strokes of the birch rod. It was for his bravery upon this occasion that Brown was presented with one of his gold medals. In all these cases the jury had refused to allow the plea of insanity. But Roderick Maclean's attempt in 1882 had a different issue. On this occasion the pistol was found to have been loaded, and the public indignation, emphasised as it was by Victoria's growing popularity, was particularly great. Either for this or for some other reason, the procedure of the last 40 years was abandoned, and Maclean was tried for high treason. The result was what might have been expected. The jury brought in a verdict of not guilty but insane, and the prisoner was sent to an asylum during Her Majesty's pleasure. Their verdict, however, produced a remarkable consequence. Victoria, who doubtless carried in her mind some memory of Albert's disapproval of a similar verdict in the case of Oxford, was very much annoyed. What did the jury mean, she asked, by saying that Maclean was not guilty? It was perfectly clear that he was guilty. She had seen him fire off the pistol herself. It was in vain that Her Majesty's constitutional advisers reminded her of the principle of English law, which lays down that no man can be found guilty of a crime unless he be proved to have had a criminal intention. Victoria was quite unconvinced. "If that is the law," she said, "the law must be altered." And altered it was. In 1883 an Act was passed changing the form of the verdict in cases of insanity, and the confusing anomaly remains upon the statute book to this day. But it was not only through the feelings, commiserating or indignant, of personal sympathy that the Queen and her people were being drawn more nearly together. They were beginning at last to come to a close and permanent agreement upon the conduct of public affairs. Mr. Gladstone's second administration, 1880-85, was a succession of failures, ending in disaster and disgrace. Liberalism fell into discredit with the country, and Victoria perceived with joy that her distrust of her ministers was shared by an ever-increasing number of her subjects. During the crisis in the Sudan, the popular temper was her own. she had been among the first to urge the